What's up guys, this is Ben from Rad Tech. This is the second video in the PC building series, and today we'll be talking about CPUs. Now that we've talked about your case, the next thing to figure out is the CPU. There's two main brands when it comes to choosing your CPU. You've got AMD and Intel. The biggest physical difference is that AMD has the pins on the CPU facing up or down when you put it in the motherboard, and then Intel has no pins. The motherboard has the pins where the contacts on the CPU touch. The other differences would be price. AMD has been known to be cheaper, so if you're a little bit more on the budget-friendly options, then AMD will be the one for you. If you're a little bit more liberal with your budget, then Intel is the one for you. Intel also has a few more built-in features, so hence the higher price. When you're looking into CPUs, you'll notice obviously the two brands, and then there will be a whole string of numbers and letters that you may have no idea what they mean. So this video will hopefully help explain the basics of that so you can figure out which one you want to buy. We'll start with AMD. So with AMD you have the Ryzen line. That's what most people buy. There's also the Threadrippers, but that's very high-end and can cost up to $2,000 Canadian. Not very applicable for the average users, so I won't focus on those. AMD's Ryzen series is currently in its third gen. So they've had Gen 1, 2, and 3. With the Ryzen series, you'll get 4 numbers and sometimes a letter for the product name. AMD's Ryzen series comes in multiple different tiers. So when you're looking at the product name, first you'll see is AMD Ryzen, and then you'll see the tier. So it'll be Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7, and then newly introduced with the third generation is the Ryzen 9. After that, you'll see 4 digits plus sometimes another letter. The first of the 4 digits, the thousandths digit, talks about the generation. So 1, 2, and 3. First generation, second generation, and third generation. The second digit, or the hundredths digit, explains the performance or the power level. So obviously the higher number means the more power you're going to get out of this CPU. The last 2 digits, the tens and the ones digit, usually are zeros, but when used, they'll identify different features used on this CPU. For example, the Ryzen 9 3900 versus the 3950. The 50 tells you that there's more cores and threads on the 3950 versus the 3900. And then there's a letter at the end, so most often you'll see an X, and the X means that the CPU is unlocked, so that means that you can overclock it a little bit more than the other ones. And that is AMD. Next, we've got Intel. Intel follows the same structure, but with more generations, but still keeping the same level of tiers. Instead of Ryzen, you'll see the I, and then you'll see the tiers. So i3, i5, i7, and i9. So from there, you'll also have the 4 digits. In the same way, the first digit, or the thousandths digit, talks about the generation. So Intel also has their Xeon series, but as like the Threadripper, we won't be covering that today. We'll just be sticking to the I series. So, like Ryzen, they have the 4 digits. The first digit, or the thousandths digit, is explaining the generation. Currently they're at generation 9. 10th generation is on its way soon. The second digit, or the hundredths digit, as with Ryzen, explains the power level or the performance level. The third number, or the 10th digit, is a SKU number, or to identify special features used on this chip. These don't really come into play much when you're making custom builds, so it's not something that you have to pay attention to too much. Lastly is the letter at the end of this string of characters. This letter will usually explain more features or details about this chip. A very common one would be the K, which is unlocked, so you can overclock it a lot more. And that is Intel. So that's great and all, but what does that mean once we've figured out what this naming scheme means? When you're looking for a CPU, you have to determine what you're going to be using your computer for most. Whether that's some simple internet browsing, video editing, or 3D rendering, gaming, what have you. Once you've determined that, then it's time to figure out what kind of CPU you actually need. So when buying a CPU, there's a few factors that you need to think about. There's 4 things in a CPU that determine the different pricing. And those are the cores, the cache, the integrated graphics, and the frequency. So let's start with cores. A core in a CPU used to be the one CPU running all of the work. Now, as technology has advanced, CPUs have multiple cores per unit. Each core is basically its own processor. Multiple cores work together as one processor. Processors with multiple cores can run multiple tasks at the same time by splitting up all the tasks between each core. Along your research, you may come across the term threads along with cores. A thread is basically a command that is being sent to the processor to be processed, and the cores are what processes these commands. Sometimes cores can run 2 threads at one time. So if you see a core that says 4/8, that means it has 4 cores and can run 2 processes per core, or 2 threads per core. Computers made mostly for gaming won't need a super high core count because most games aren't coded to utilize a lot of cores. However, if you're making a computer mostly for video editing or 3D rendering, then more cores is better for you because that means that it can process more of these processes at once. Inside of each CPU, there's a tiny little bit of super fast memory, and this is called the cache. The larger the cache means the more files that it can hold for quicker retrieval. And then we have integrated graphics. Integrated graphics is basically a graphics card mixed in with the CPU, so you don't need an external GPU like a GTX 1070, for example. If you're going to be using your computer mostly for internet browsing, then a integrated graphics CPU will be good for you because your tasks won't be super high intensive on the graphics side. But if you're going to be making a computer for gaming or 3D rendering, then you don't necessarily need to have a CPU that has integrated graphics because you'll probably want to buy a graphics card. I'll be talking about GPUs in video 5 of this series, so stay tuned for that. Intel seems to have had integrated graphics a little bit more than AMD has. You'll usually see a G at the end of the product name, which means it has integrated graphics. AMD doesn't usually integrate the integrated graphics into their cards. This is possibly to support the purchasing of their own Radeon graphics card system. But sometimes you can find integrated graphics on the AMD series, usually on the lower end, like the Ryzen 3 series. And then finally we have the frequency. It's usually shown in gigahertz or GHz or Z for you Americans. This number shows the speed at which the CPU can run through all these tasks. So 1 hertz means 1 cycle per second. 1 gigahertz is 1 billion hertz. So that means that if your CPU has 1 gigahertz of speed, then that means that it can process 1 billion processes per second. When it comes to frequency, sometimes the larger number doesn't always turn out to be better performance. When it comes to video editing, sometimes more cores means better performance than higher speed. However, with gaming, more speed turns out to be better than more cores. Another way that the price will be impacted would be the socket, which is basically whether the chip is AMD or Intel. Typically AMD is cheaper, so that's why socket could come into play. So now that we know everything about the CPUs, now it comes down to the price. Sometimes when you're building a PC, budget is more important to you than the actual performance. So let's look at some of the prices with different ranges. Let's start with the $50 to $100 range. Within this price range, this will support lifestyles or productivity ranges of mostly internet browsing, spreadsheets, nothing too high intensive. If you want to be running multiple windows open at the same time or multiple tasks running at the same time, then you might want to look into a CPU with 2 or 4 cores. So within that price range, you might be looking at something like an AMD 1300 or a Ryzen 3 2200. Those are both pretty cheap now, and they'll be able to support your browsing, spreadsheets, Microsoft Word, all of that. Next up, we've got the gaming range, which is from 100, 150, all the way up to about 250. With gaming, usually it's better to have a very strong GPU than a very strong CPU, while keeping in mind the bottlenecks that can occur with the differences between the two. So since we'll be spending more money on the GPU for this gaming rig, we can save a bit of money and go with something like an AMD Ryzen 5 or an Intel Core i5 and save a bit of money instead of going with the Ryzen 7 or the Intel i7. Next up, we've got the creative media or overclocking range, which is from $250-ish to $400. In this range, you'll be wanting to get something with more cores and or more speed, depending on what you're going to be using with this chip. Within this range, you'll want to be looking towards something like a Core i7, Core i9, or a Ryzen 7, or the new Ryzen 9 series. These are also chips that you'll be looking at if you want to be overclocking your system as well. Keep in mind that you'll be wanting to look for the K on Intel and the X on AMD for that extra overclocking performance. And then we've got the big workstation power horse range, which is $400 plus. In this range, this is something that you'll be looking at if you're, for example, doing a lot of 3D modeling and rendering. Earlier on I said I wouldn't be talking about the Threadripper, but this is a great place for the Threadripper because it's got up to, I think now, 64 cores, which will be cutting through all of your rendering in no time. Something on the more budget friendly would be something like the AMD Ryzen 9 3950X, which will have quite a bit of power for sticking within the normal AM socket. So while making this video, we're up to the Ryzen 3rd Gen series and the Intel 10th Gen. Intel's 10th generation is currently being rolled out now, and AMD's Ryzen 4th generation will be coming out sometime later this fall. So it's up to you if you want to go and buy something now with the current pricing, or wait till those new processors come out and buy one of those newer, stronger CPUs, or get one of the current generations then, which will probably be much cheaper. So that's it for the CPUs. Now that we've figured that out, now we can go on to motherboards, which will be next. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so that you don't miss that video. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and follow me on Instagram to see more behind the scenes of this series. Peace.